parent's worst nightmare.
There wasn't anything that led me to believe that there was anything dangerous here.
I said, I strongly advise you go to the hospital.
911 emergency, require please fire ambulance.
Hi, yes, my son's not breathing.
During transport, his heart had stopped for about 45 minutes.
He was very sick. He was septic with whatever bacteria caused his meningitis.
Followed by a criminal investigation.
Upon receiving the autopsy report, that I became suspicious that they were going to lay charges.
And a media frenzy, along with a social media backlash.
The amount of death threats that began flowing in immediately.
Death threats?
Death threats.
To you?
We've had over 300.
Oh my goodness.
A jury finds David and Collet Stephan guilty for failing to provide the necessaries of life for their son, Ezekiel.
It wasn't until anti-vax said something's really wrong with this case that we were able to kind of get a grip on things and realize that something was really wrong with this case.
If people are lying under oath, what's the point of the show of having somebody raise their hand like they're on the People's Court with Judge Wapner, and they come to court and lie because there's no consequence to it?
I think you can't take away our rights as parents.
What we're doing here is helping to uphold parental rights.
Where's the line between parental rights and parental responsibilities?
Like, we didn't do anything wrong. We were doing what we thought normal parents would do.
This and much more on Fighting for Ezekiel, a Bridge City News exclusive.
Many of you will remember this controversial court decision from the spring of 2016, in which David and Collet Stephan were found guilty of not providing the necessaries of life for their 19-month-old son Ezekiel. He died from what the Crown alleges was bacterial meningitis. Now, since that time, the parents appealed their conviction, and the Supreme Court of Canada granted them a retrial, which will be held in June of next year. The case invoked strong opinions on both sides, with the Stephans on one hand viewed as loving parents, or on the other hand, as negligent parents worthy of jail time. Our special Fighting for Ezekiel will tackle the issue of parental rights, with the Stephans fighting for the right to treat their own children with natural remedies, and the Crown fighting for vulnerable children whose parents are seen as being anti-physician and having extreme views on natural health. Media coverage placed much of the focus on this, asking questions such as, were the parents treating their son for bacterial meningitis using fruit juice and garlic? In this 5-part series, there will be pieces of the story that you've not heard before. Was evidence withheld by the Crown? Is it possible that there may have been criminal negligence in the case and a potential cover-up? Should the Stephans have recognized much sooner that their son was in need of medical attention? Our team did request interviews from the Crown and medical experts who testified, but they either declined or did not reply. Coming up, we will share opinions from third-party medical and legal experts on the case, and we have an exclusive interview with David and Collet Stephan.
David and Collet, can you tell us right from the start here how things shaped up here? Your son Ezekiel took ill, and maybe share what the symptoms were, what went through your head, what were you thinking at that time?
Well, I remember it being a Monday, and I just remember Collet giving me a phone call and just saying, you know, we've got a sick boy here. And so when I arrived, we put the boys into the car, and I remember Ezekiel was visibly uncomfortable, and so put him into his car seat, and he was crying, and there just seemed to be some appearance of starting to get ill. It just kind of progressed throughout the night, and Collet began to consult at that time with her friend, who was a birth attendant and had delivered both Ezekiel and Ezra, and so she began to consult with her, as she was also an emergency room nurse and had a lot of experience with that.
I did hold up the phone so she could kind of hear his breathing, because his breathing had a sound that didn't normally make. And so I think we had discussed, you know, the difference between croup and whooping cough. Mm-hmm. And she had mentioned that the sound, because it was a little bit more in the chest, was more of a croup sound.
Okay.
I remember that we had talked about things that I did with my kids when they had croup, how the fresh air really seemed to help. I would sit by the patio door with the door cracked open and rock my children back and forth, and in the wee hours of the morning. Sometimes I took them and sat out with them, holding them in the car, just for that fresh air. And I do also remember suggesting possibly going to the hospital and having a nebulizer treatment.
Now, if I understand correctly, over the next week or so, Ezekiel was actually improving. Is that correct?
Yes.
Okay, so typical cold kind of symptoms, croup-like symptoms. Was there a bit of a cough along with it, or kind of a wheezy breathing maybe?
Yeah, there's more the wheezy breathing.
Okay.
And so because he was breathing with his mouth open, his mouth was drying out. So I wanted to make sure that it stayed hydrated, hence the eyedropper, to make sure that he was getting enough fluids, because in my opinion he wasn't getting enough.
Okay.
And so we just kept on that, and it just kept getting better every day.
He wasn't 100% better, but he was definitely getting better. And so then it was by Sunday again that we were back to church, and then Monday they went back to parent preschool again. And so that was kind of like the end of the croup symptoms. And then there is, a few days after that is when something new kind of began that left us wondering, did he pick something up from parent preschool or from church when we took him there now?
Then his symptoms were different. They were more cold-like. And so one day he'd be having like cold or flu symptoms, and the next day they were gone. And then the following day they'd come back again. And so I just, out of unsure of why it was coming and going, I just thought, instead of exposing him to a bunch of other people who would be carrying viruses, he obviously has a lower immune system. I'll see if my friend could come out, check his vitals, see if she sees anything worth going in for.
And then when I got there, he was sleeping on her bed in her room. I really just did more of a visual inspection and looked at him. He did not look alarmingly unwell. There was nothing outward that made you go, oh, that boy's sick. He didn't feel warm. I did listen to his lungs with my stethoscope. And again, his lungs were clear. There was no unusual bleeding. There were no signs or symptoms to be alarming that way. So then our discussion moved to what could it be, and I did talk with Collet that I thought, there was nothing outward, so it was more likely something more internal. And that's when our discussion turned again to meningitis. And so we went out and looked it up on the computer and found some different signs that you could test for. That's about as far as that discussion went. As far as the meningitis, I did suggest that, knowledge is power, and you might want to take him into the doctor to get checked.
Upon having that conversation that there was a potential viral meningitis, we just said, okay, let's get him on the natural supplements, but if anything turns for the worse, if he starts to progress in any way, then let's take him into a doctor just to be on the safe side. And he had a great sleep the next night. Now we're into Tuesday morning, and his symptoms are decreasing, and he seems like everything's going in the right direction.
As we just heard, their parents have a lethargic toddler on their hands with some outward symptoms over roughly a 2-week time period. Although their friend, a registered nurse, didn't find any symptoms worthy of an emergency visit, she says she did recommend that they take him to a doctor for a checkup. The question remains, should they have done so?
Okay, so he's been doing relatively well on Monday, and now he had a good sleep on the Monday night too. So Tuesday, this is the day he actually stopped breathing. That's when, that particular day, he had some negative symptoms.
Yes, but leading up to that, so remember we'd had the discussion on the Monday saying if anything progressed, we'd take him to the doctor. Yeah. Well, if anything progressed for the worse, but he actually progressed for the better, and by the point that we got into midday, he actually had no symptoms that were visible. But then, he woke up, I would say about an hour and a half, 2 hours into his nap, and he developed this interesting breathing pattern, but was still able to consume liquids. And so she had called me just to see how he was doing, and I just let her know, well, he seems fine, but he does have this interesting breathing pattern, but nothing to be alarmed about. I don't know what's going on here, but it's nothing's alarming. He seems fine. He seems content, and she decided to come home anyways, and as we were trying to assess it in a short period of time, it went from being just something of interest, like, is this something that we need to act on? Like, everything else is fine, to now he's not breathing.
So that just came on that suddenly.
It came on pretty quick, pretty rapidly before we had a chance to determine if there was actually something that needed to be acted upon at that moment. But there was no other symptoms that were flu-like in nature or meningitis-like in nature. There was nothing else there that was going on at that time.
And then suddenly he's not breathing. What was your response to that?
Phone 911. You know, the thought process in my mind was, did he just aspirate on, you know, some of the stuff we'd given him a couple minutes before? You know, what's going on? Like, it was for me, it was incredible confusion, because we thought, like I said before, that he would be up and running the next day.
And I was there the night before Ezekiel died. And I saw nothing that alarmed me at all. There wasn't anything that said, take this young man into the hospital now. And believe me, there's been times when I've said that. We need to go to the hospital.
So in other words, you're saying you're not anti-medicine establishment in that sense. We need doctors. You're okay with that. But you didn't see any kind of symptoms that were unusual in Ezekiel other than normal cold symptoms. Did he have energy? Was he okay that way?
Yeah, he had recovered. He'd recovered from croup. I didn't see him when he had the croup.
Okay.
But I was out there working with David. We worked together in the business that we have. And I was out there, I don't know, 5, 6 o'clock at night. And I visited with the little guy, and he crawled across the bed, and he wasn't moping. I won't say that he was just a ball of energy, but how did we look when we recovered from a cold or a flu? We're not 100% full of energy. But there wasn't anything that led me to believe that there was anything dangerous here. Had there been, I would have taken them myself. I wouldn't have had to. They would have.
Right.
But there's no question.
911 emergency, require please fire ambulance.
Hi, yes, my son's not breathing.
And so called 911. I'm running down the driveway because we just moved to the this rural location a couple months before. I didn't know what the county number was out on our driveway. Yeah, and you know, the driveway is probably about 75 yards long or something like that. So I'm doing a sprint down there to get that. Meanwhile, Colette is attending to Ezekiel inside. I get them the number. I run back in, and Ezekiel's breathing again.
And had you done mouth-to-mouth on him already at this time, or?
So when it appeared like he had choked on something, I had patted his back fairly aggressively, and he kind of did this cough, and he was breathing. And I think that was about the time that he had gotten on the phone with his dad. But then he had stopped breathing again. By then I was already in the bedroom, so I had laid him down and started CPR on him. And I wasn't long into it. He started coughing, so I had turned him on his side, and he had mucus coming out of his mouth. And I just kept patting his back while he was coughing it up, and that's when he had called 911. Then, as David had run out to get our location, I had him. He had rolled back over, and then he had stopped breathing, so then I performed CPR again.
We got him into the car. We drove a mile down gravel road. It was about 3 miles of gravel roads that we had to drive down, and that's when he stopped breathing again. It was about a mile into the drive down a bumpy gravel road. So, you know, did we dislodge some mucus? What took place there? We don't know. So Colette starts performing CPR. I get on the phone with 911 to give a location, and so then I end up handing the phone back to Colette while she's doing CPR. And we end up meeting the ambulance about 6 kilometers, 5 kilometers outside of Cardston. And so it was 11 minutes, I believe, into the 911 call. So from the time that he stopped breathing that we met with them. And then they took over the care of Ezekiel at that point. But up until that point, he was getting CPR.
In the ambulance, I understand that it wasn't properly equipped. And this is a whole other part of the story here. You know, why were the ambulances not properly equipped with equipment for, you know, somebody Ezekiel's size, 18, 19 months old? They didn't have the right equipment, I'm told, for the right masks, the right intubation equipment, either too big or too small, so the air didn't get to where it needed to go, right?
Correct.
Yeah, there was an over 8-minute period where they weren't able to get any oxygen into him whatsoever.
According to the Stephans and witnesses at their church, Ezekiel's health seemed to be improving. So it remains somewhat of a mystery as to what caused the toddler to stop breathing. Was it a result of bacterial meningitis and a lung infection, as the Crown alleges, or was it something else? Once the ambulance arrived at the Cardston Hospital, Ezekiel's breathing and heartbeat were restored. A medical team then transported him to the Lethbridge Hospital, where they would then meet up with Stars Air Ambulance. Upon arrival in Lethbridge, physicians attended to Ezekiel for about an hour and 15 minutes before flying him to Calgary.
What happens then at the Children's Hospital when Ezekiel does arrive?
They sat us down and began to discuss, kind of what took place, what was going on at the time that he was currently getting CT scans, and talked about basically the prognosis, and it didn't look good because during transport his heart had stopped for about 45 minutes, is what they had said, and that he was basically in a medically induced coma. So that's what we thought we were working with. We didn't think we were working with brain death. We didn't know about the issue that took place in the ambulance that would result in brain death with that hypoxic injury.
Okay, and they did some CT scans. You're in a little bit of shock right now, probably. And were any of those results passed on at all, or?
They were passed on. And what the radiologist communicated in the notes is that there was swelling in the brain due to hypoxic injury.
Okay, so lack of oxygen.
The lack of oxygen from the ambulance.
So while at the Children's Hospital, what did the doctors try to do to save Ezekiel's life? Did they tell you what kind of things they tried?
They just had him on life support.
Okay.
By Thursday, they were diagnosing Ezekiel with having brain death.
It is indeed a nightmare situation for any parent, but it gets even more difficult for David and Collet when they later learn that police would be laying charges against them. That's coming up on Part 2 tomorrow.
Next time on Fighting for Ezekiel.
Upon receiving the autopsy report, that I became suspicious that they were going to lay charges. The amount of death threats that began flowing in immediately.
Death threats?
Death threats.
To you?
We've had over 300.
Oh my goodness.
The Crown was trying to use our court case as a precedent-setting case wherein parents could be held criminally liable if they didn't vaccinate their children.
Would you label yourselves as anti-vaxxers?
I guess probably the best way to answer is, are we for vaccines?
This and more in Part 2 of Fighting for Ezekiel.